Ever get that feeling like using some software is like, well, pulling teeth?
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. So frustrating.
Yeah, and you know what I've realized?
What's that?
Often, it all comes down to the API. If the API is a mess, the whole experience is a mess.
Yeah, it's like the software speaking a language only it understands.
And nobody's got time for that. So today, we're diving into a book that promises to make our lives easier. Build APIs you won't hate.
Ah, yes, Phil Sturgeon. I like his style. Very practical.
Okay, so right off the bat, Sturgeon emphasizes dummy data. Why is that so important?
Well, think about it. You're building an API, testing things out, and boom, you accidentally send a test email to thousands of real customers.
Yikes, that's got to be a nightmare.
It is. Actually happened to a developer. Cost the company a fortune, over £200,000. All because they used real customer data during development.
Ouch, yeah, that's a hard lesson learned.
Right. So instead, you use libraries like Faker. Generate realistic but fake data. Saves you a world of trouble.
So basically creating a safe space for your API to play around in before it's unleashed on the real world.
Exactly. And then there's database seeding, using tools like Laravel to populate your development database with that dummy data.
So you're not stuck manually creating tons of test data every time.
Nope. Automates the whole thing. Much more efficient. Okay, so once you've got your dummy data sorted, you got to think about the design of your API, and Sturgeon's all about RESTful principles, specifically the debate over verbs and nouns in your endpoints.
Right, that whole thing about how you structure the URLs. Remind me about that debate again.
So basically, it's nouns versus verbs. Do you focus on the actions, like send message, or the resources themselves, like messages?
I see. So one way focuses on what you're doing and the other focuses on what you're working with.
Right. And Sturgeon argues that RESTful APIs should be noun-centric. So instead of send message, you'd have messages and use different HTTP methods like POST to create a new message.
Keeps things consistent, huh?
Exactly. Makes the API more predictable for developers. And speaking of consistency, things like naming conventions matter a lot. Always use plurals, for example, even for single resources.
Little things made a big difference.
They really do. Another example is the choice between sub-resources and embedded data. Remember, sub-resources.
Vaguely. Those nested URLs that let you access related data. Right. Like users one posts to see all the posts by user number one.
Exactly. But sometimes it's more efficient to embed that data directly within a resource.
So instead of making separate requests for the user and their posts, you get it all in one go.
Yep. It's a trade-off, though. Sometimes you want that separation, sometimes you want that efficiency. It all depends on your specific data and what you're trying to achieve.
Right. You got to choose the right tool for the job.
Okay, now let's switch gears a bit and talk about the language of APIs, HTTP.
All right. I know the basics, DT and POST, but I'm guessing there's more to it.
Oh, absolutely. Put and delete are crucial for updating and deleting data. Then there's the whole debate around data formats.
I remember reading something about mixing JSON and form data being a big no-no. Why is that?
Okay, imagine JSON like a beautifully organized package, everything labeled and in its place. Form data, on the other hand, it's like throwing everything into a random bag.
Chaos.
Exactly, and mixing those two. Recipe for disaster. Stick with JSON. Keep things clean and consistent. Now, about those HTTP status codes.
Right. 404 means not found. What else is there?
There are tons. Using the right status code gives developers valuable feedback. Like a 201 code means, hey, you created that resource successfully.
So it's about sending clear signals back to the developer about what's happening on the server side.
Precisely. And then, of course, there's error handling. When things go wrong and you want clear and helpful error messages.
Oh, tell me about it. I've wasted countless hours trying to decipher cryptic error messages.
Right. So instead of just a generic error code, give developers something useful. Context, potential solutions, the works.
So it's like holding their hand through the debugging process.
Kind of. And there are standards for this too, like JSON API and problem details for HTTP APIs. Helps keep things consistent and predictable.
So it's like establishing a universal language for errors.
Exactly. Makes everyone's lives easier. Okay, now let's talk about testing.
Yeah.
Because nobody likes nasty surprises, right?
True, but it's all just code in the end, isn't it?
It is, but testing your API is like making sure all the gears are meshing properly before you start the engine.
I see you're not just testing the individual parts, you're testing how they work together.
Right. And Sturgeon recommends testing at the endpoint level, simulating how a real client would use your API.
And tools like Behat can help with that, right?
Exactly. It's all about making sure your API behaves as expected in real-world scenarios.
Now, the book also mentions this thing called test-driven development, or TDD. Is that where you write tests before you even write the code?
You got it. Might seem counterintuitive, but it forces you to think about what you want your API to do before you start building it.
Like creating a blueprint before you start construction.
Perfect analogy. Leads to a more robust and well-designed API in the long run. Now, APIs often deal with lots of interconnected data, which can get tricky.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Sturgeon talks about the 1 plus n problem. Basically, if you have to make a separate request for every piece of related data, your API is going to be slow.
So it's like going back and forth to the fridge for every ingredient instead of just grabbing everything you need at once.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Super inefficient. So the book explores ways to handle this. Sub-resources, we talked about those, but also things like compound documents and embedded documents.
Sit this down for me.
Compound documents are like bundles of related data you can retrieve with one request. Embedded documents take it further and nest the data directly within the main resource.
So it's all about finding the most efficient way to package up that related data.
Right. And there are tools like Fractal that can help manage these relationships and present the data to clients in a nice, clean way. Now, all of this, the data, the efficiency, it doesn't matter if your API isn't secure.
Right. Security is key. And one of the biggest myths is that you can just rely on those session-based authentications like you would with a regular website.
Wait, why wouldn't that work? I thought sessions were, the standard.
They are for websites. But APIs, they work differently. Sessions depend on cookies and server-side state, which doesn't really fly with the whole stateless nature of APIs.
So you need a different approach for securing those API conversations.
Yep. The book talks about different options, from the super basic HTTP basic authentication to the much more robust OAuth 2.0.
OAuth 2.0, that's like the Fort Knox of API security, right?
Pretty much. It uses all these things, grant types, access tokens, refresh tokens, to really lock things down.
So each client gets like a customized key to access only the data they're allowed to.
Exactly. Keeps everything safe and sound.
Wow, we've covered a lot. Dummy data, RESTful design, HTTP, error handling, testing, even security. It's clear that building a good API is a lot more than just spitting out data.
You got it. It's about thoughtful design choices that make life easier for developers, which ultimately means better software for everyone.
Well said. There's still a lot more to uncover, so we'll be right back in part 2 to continue our deep dive into build APIs you won't hate. All right, we're back, driving deeper into build APIs you won't hate. Last time we talked about things like REST and HTTP and all that good stuff.
We did. Covered some important ground, but there's still a lot to unpack, like documentation, for example.
Documentation. Yeah, sometimes it feels like an afterthought, but I'm guessing it's actually super important.
It's crucial. Think of it like a user manual for your API. Developers need to understand how to use it, right?
Right. So it's not just about listing all the technical details. It's got to be approachable, understandable.
Exactly. It's a conversation, not a lecture. Anticipate questions, show common use cases, give clear examples.
Makes it user-friendly, even if it's for, well, other developers.
Exactly. And there are tools that can help with this. API Blueprint and Aglio can turn those boring technical specs into something pretty nice to look at.
Yeah, those tools can generate some pretty snazzy documentation for Markdown. It's like making the API look good, too.
Right. You want developers to actually enjoy using your documentation.
Makes sense. Now, even with the best documentation, keeping it up to date can be a challenge. APIs evolve, things change.
That's true, and that's where versioning comes in. You got to find a way to manage those changes without disrupting everyone who's using your API.
Right, we talked about those different versioning strategies before. URL versioning, header versioning, feature flagging, all that.
Yep, and each approach has its pros and cons. URL versioning. Simple, but your URLs can get messy. Header versioning's more flexible, but requires custom headers. Feature flagging gives you a lot of control, but things get complex fast.
So there's no magic bullet, just different tools for different situations.
Pretty much. You got to weigh the trade-offs and choose what works best for you. Okay, now for something a little more, well, mind-bending. HadeOS.
HadeOS, oh yeah, it sounds pretty intimidating. Remind me what it's all about again.
Hypermedia as the engine of application state. The idea is to make your API self-descriptive.
Self-descriptive. So the API tells you how to use it.
Exactly. You embed links and other metadata within the responses. It's like giving the API a built-in navigation system.
So clients can discover what actions they can take without needing to constantly refer to the documentation.
Exactly. It's pretty cool when you think about it. It's like the API is guiding you through the whole process.
Okay, I'm starting to get it.
Yeah.
But how does this work in practice?
One key thing is content negotiation. Using that accept header to let clients request different data formats, JSON or whatever they need.
Right, we talked about that before, but with HeyDOS, it's more than just choosing a format.
Right. It's about offering different representations of a resource, each with specific links and instructions. Makes the API super dynamic.
Wow, it's like the API adapts to the client's needs in real time. Pretty amazing. But even with all this fancy stuff, we got to remember that APIs are always changing.
True. New features, old features being retired, it's a constant evolution. And that brings us back to versioning.
Because you don't want to break things for everyone who's already using your API.
Exactly. You want to make those transitions as smooth as possible. So let's go back to those versioning strategies. We've got URL versioning, header versioning, feature flagging.
Each with its own set of pluses and minuses.
Yep. URL versioning, simple but messy. Header versioning, flexible but requires custom headers. Feature flagging, granular control but more complex.
That's all about choosing a right approach for the job, right?
Absolutely. And the book actually gives some cool examples of how companies like GitHub and Facebook handle versioning.
Oh, yeah. What do they do?
Well, GitHub uses this thing called content negotiation with media types to manage their versions in a RESTful way. Keeps their URLs nice and clean.
So they get the best of both worlds, elegance and practicality.
Yep. Facebook, on the other hand, they go all in with feature flagging. Gives them incredibly granular control over their massive graph API.
That makes sense. Facebook's API is huge. They need that level of control.
Right. They can turn features on and off for different apps, test new things out, and slowly transition everyone without breaking anything.
It's like they can customize the API for each client.
In a way, yeah. It's super powerful, but also quite complex to manage.
So always trade-offs, no matter what you choose.
Always. There's no perfect solution for versioning. You got to understand the options, weigh the pros and cons, and pick what makes sense for your API. But versioning is just one piece of the puzzle.
Right, we've talked about so much. Dummy data, REST, HeyDOS, and now versioning. It's a lot to take in.
It is. But we're not done yet. There's even more to explore in the final part of our deep dive into Build APIs You Won't Hate.
And we're back, wrapping up our deep dive into Build APIs You Won't Hate. We've learned so much already.
We have, but there's always more to discover. Today, let's look at some of those little details that can really make an API shine.
Right, those subtle things that can make a huge difference for the developers using your API.
Exactly. Things like using consistent naming conventions, writing clear error messages, and structuring those responses in a logical way makes the whole experience so much smoother.
It's all about making the API a joy to work with, right?
Absolutely. Now, we've talked about dummy data for testing and development, but what happens when your API goes live and you're dealing with huge amounts of data?
Things can get a little, well, overwhelming.
They can. That's where pagination comes in. It's all about breaking those large data sets into smaller, more manageable chunks.
Right, we touched on this earlier, like dividing a giant book into chapters.
Perfect analogy. And there are different ways to do this. Simple page-based pagination, offset-based, even cursor-based approaches.
Okay, hold on. Cursor-based, that sounds a bit more technical.
It is a bit. Think of a cursor like a pointer to a specific place in your data set. The client gets this cursor and uses it to request the next chunk of data.
So it's like a secret code that tells the API where to pick up from.
Exactly. Really efficient for those massive data sets where things are constantly changing. Now, let's circle back to HTTP for a moment. We've talked about it a lot, but it's the heart of how APIs communicate.
Get, key, post-T, all those verbs. But the book says there's a whole lot more to it.
There is. Those HTTP status codes, for example, they're not just random numbers.
Yeah, they tell you whether your request succeeded, failed, or something in between.
Right. And Using the correct status code is key for clear communication. A 201 for a successful creation, a 400 for a bad request, things like that.
So it's all about giving developers the right feedback so they know exactly what's going on.
Precisely. And when things do go wrong, you want to provide helpful error messages, not just a generic code, but real context and potential solutions.
Right, those cryptic error messages can be a nightmare.
Totally. So give developers the information they need to debug effectively. And again, there are standards for this, like JSON API and problem details for HTTP APIs. Helps keep things consistent.
Consistency is key.
It really is. Now, no matter how well designed your API is, it's all for nothing if it's not secure. We talked about how those traditional website authentication methods don't really work for APIs.
Yeah, because sessions rely on those cookies and server-side state, which isn't how APIs typically operate.
Exactly. So you need something more robust. HTTP basic authentication is an option, but OAuth 2.0 is the real deal.
OAuth 2.0, yeah, that's the big leagues.
It is. It uses those access tokens to control who can access what. It's like giving each client a special key to unlock specific parts of your API.
And you can even revoke those keys if you need to, right?
Yep. Super powerful stuff. So we've gone through so much, from dummy data to REST, HDOS, pagination, and now security. Building a great API, it's a journey.
It really is. And Build APIs You Won't Hate has been an amazing guide. Thanks for sharing your expertise.
Happy to help. It's all about making life easier for developers and ultimately creating better software for everyone.
Absolutely. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into Build APIs You Won't Hate. We hope you've enjoyed it and learned a thing or two about building APIs that people will actually love to use.